The morning it happened, nobody was watching. That is the thing about the moments that change everything. They do not arrive with ceremony. They do not send notice ahead of themselves. They come quietly, dressed in the ordinary clothing of any other day, and it is only later, sometimes much later, when you are sitting somewhere safe and still, turning the whole sequence of events over in your hands like a stone you found in a river, that you understand what you were actually living through when you thought you were living through nothing at all. The morning it happened, Ngozi Adaeze was in the kitchen of the Osei-Mensah compound, peeling yam over a wooden board, while the morning birds were still deciding whether the sky was ready for them. The generator had come on at 5, which meant the kitchen lights were burning and the fan above the counter was spinning, and the whole room smelled of onion and the particular warmth of a kitchen that has been awake since before the people in it fully are. She was thinking about her mother. She was often thinking about her mother at this hour, when the thinking could still be gentle, before the day got loud enough to push everything quiet underneath it. She was not thinking about Baba Theo. She was not thinking about the Bible. She was not thinking about the letter that, by the end of this day, would make a man who owned 7 acres of land and a share in 3 buildings in London sit down in the middle of his study and press both hands over his mouth. None of that was in her mind yet. Peeling yam, listening to birds, thinking about her mother. That was all. If this story is already warming your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to Village Heart, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing our little village reaches so far. Ngozi Adaeze was 24 years old. She had the kind of face that people described as pleasant, which meant they meant it, but they did not stop to look twice. She was not tall. She was not the kind of woman who made a room shift when she entered it. What she was, and this was a thing that took people time to notice, and then once they noticed it they could not stop noticing it, was present. Completely and utterly present in whatever room she stood in, whatever task she was doing, whatever person happened to be speaking to her. When Ngozi listened, she heard not just the words but the weight underneath them. When she watched something unfold before her, she saw not just the surface of the thing but the whole quiet story moving behind it, the way you can sometimes see the bottom of a stream through moving water if the light is right and you are willing to be still long enough. She had learned to see this way out of necessity. Necessity is, in the end, the mother of all true things. She had been the eldest child in a household that ran on margins so thin they barely qualified as margins at all. Her mother, Mama Chisholm, had been sick for 4 years now, the kind of illness that the doctors at the government hospital managed with careful prescription and careful language, saying things like stable and controlled, which meant that it would not kill her this month or next month, but it would require medication every month for the rest of her life, and that medication cost more than Ngozi earned in 3 weeks of early mornings and late nights in a rich man's kitchen. There were 2 younger brothers. Samuel was still in secondary school, which Ngozi paid for with a quiet ferocity she never mentioned to anyone. Emeka had just begun an apprenticeship learning to repair motorcycles in the compound of a mechanic 2 streets over, which meant he brought in almost nothing yet and needed almost everything. The 4 of them lived in 2 rooms in a part of town where the road had not yet been paved and the electricity came and went according to a schedule that nobody, not even the electrician 2 streets over, had ever been able to predict with any reliability. This was the life Ngozi woke up at 4 in the morning for. Every day. She did not complain about it. Not because she had no capacity for complaint, she had a sharp mind and a sharper sense of the unfairness of certain arrangements, but because complaint required an audience with the time and the willingness to receive it, and nobody in her life had either. You did not complain into empty air. You moved through the morning. You peeled the yam. You caught the bus. You made the soup. You sent the money home. You did it again. The compound of Adewale Osei-Mensah sat on 7 acres on the eastern side of the city, where the roads widened and the walls around properties grew taller and the air smelled less of exhaust fumes and generator smoke and more of cut grass and the particular cleanliness of money, which has its own scent, something between fresh paint and careful distance. The main house was white and large and symmetrical, with high windows and a covered veranda that ran along the front and a driveway of paved stone that curved through manicured gardens before arriving at the front entrance. There were lights along the drive that came on automatically at dusk. There was a gate that opened with a remote and had a guard in a small booth at the entrance and cameras at every corner. Everything about the compound said that the person living inside it had arrived at a place where certain kinds of worry no longer applied. Inside the house, the floors were marble. The ceilings were high enough that sound moved through them and disappeared. The sitting room had furniture that nobody really sat in, only perched at the edges of when visitors came. The dining room had a table long enough to seat 12, and every morning a single setting was laid at one end of it, which was the only end that mattered, because Adewale Osei-Mensah ate alone. He was 47 years old. He had built what he had from the kind of beginning that polished men in boardrooms liked to call humble origins, which was their careful way of saying poor without using the word in front of the man who had escaped it. His father, the late Emmanuel Osei-Mensah, had been a trader. A compact man with an extraordinary memory for numbers and a gift for making people feel, when he was selling them something, that they were doing him a favor by wanting it. He had started with fabric at the Makola market, then moved into tools, then electronics, and what began in a single stall under a zinc roof had grown over 20 years of relentless early mornings and calculated risks into something that could be called a business without embarrassment. Adewale had taken what his father built and made it larger. He had gone to school for it, the kind of school that required scholarships and 4 years of eating one proper meal a day without writing home about the cost. He had come back and done things with supply chains and financial models that his father would not have had the vocabulary for. He had moved into real estate, then telecommunications, then the kind of diversified interests that required a lawyer who charged by the minute and a secondary office in London where things were discussed in glass rooms overlooking streets that were cold even in summer. He was not a cruel man. This is important to understand about Adewale Osei-Mensah. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed causing harm. He simply did not have the habit or perhaps the time of watching closely enough to see it. There is a particular kind of damage that only genuinely indifferent people can do. Not malicious people. Not people who mean harm. People who do not mean anything at all, who are not watching closely enough to know the weight of what they are setting in motion. This is the category to which Adewale belonged on the morning in question. He had a management consultant. The consultant's name was Kofi Asante Brew, no relation to anyone else in this story with a similar surname. A young man in an expensive suit who had been hired to audit the household operations and submit a report on efficiency. The report had been submitted 2 weeks prior. It used the word streamline 14 times. It identified 7 positions as redundant. Adewale had approved the recommendations on a Tuesday morning between 2 phone calls, which was the precise amount of attention the matter had received from him. He had not, at the time, thought of faces. Among the 14 members of staff in the compound, there was one who had been there longer than all the others combined. His name was Theophilus Asante. Everyone called him Baba Theo. They called him that from the first day without being told to, which is how it is with certain people. You simply look at them and the appropriate name arrives in you without ceremony. He was 71 years old. He had been tending the gardens of the Osei-Mensah compound for 22 years, arriving when the property was still the original house, before the marble and the 12-foot ceilings, when the compound was newer and simpler and the late Emmanuel Osei-Mensah was still alive, and would sometimes come out in the late afternoon and stand near the garden and talk to Baba Theo about plants and rainfall, and the way the soil in this part of the city was different from the soil further east. Baba Theo had come to tend the garden, and he had done so with the devotion of a man who understood, at a cellular level, that a garden was not decorative but alive, requiring patience and presence and a quality of attention that could not be scheduled because living things did not operate on schedules. Under his hands, the compound grounds had become something people noticed. The hedges moved from adequate to precise. The plumeria trees near the eastern wall grew thick and fragrant and produced flowers in 3 colors. The lawn spread smooth and deep green even through the dry season, because Baba Theo knew the water schedule that the soil required, and he knew it the way he knew his own breathing, without consulting anything written down. He was not a tall man. He had the build of a man who has spent decades bending to the earth, the upper back carrying a slight curve that came not from weakness but from decades of bowing toward growing things. His arms were lean and his hands were remarkable, large and dark and crossed with the particular geography of a working lifetime, every line and callus a record of something real. His face had the quality of certain old trees whose bark has been worn by years of weather into something that is past roughness and has arrived at something else entirely, a texture that invites touch, that communicates not hardship but endurance, which is different. His eyes were what you noticed first and returned to last. They were deep brown and very steady, the eyes of a man who had looked at enough of life to no longer be surprised by most of it, but who had also retained, against all probability, the capacity to be moved by small beautiful things. A well-turned phrase. A child laughing at something the adults had missed. The particular shade that the sky went for 7 minutes at the end of a clear day. He carried his Bible everywhere. It was not a new Bible, had not been new in any of the years Ngozi had known him. The cover was worn to a softness like old cotton. The spine had been repaired twice. The first time with adhesive tape that had since yellowed. The second time with a strip of dark leather that someone with patient hands had stitched carefully along the binding. The pages inside were thin and covered in the original text, and then, in the margins, in handwriting so small you had to lean close to read it, covered again in Baba Theo's own notations, years of them, written in 3 different colors of ink across 3 different decades, a conversation he had been having with the book his entire life. That Bible went with him everywhere in the compound. To the garden shed where he stored his tools in the morning. To the low stone wall near the eastern gate where he ate his lunch under a neem tree that he himself had planted 15 years ago, and that was now large enough to throw shade over half the footpath. To the bench near the plumeria trees where he sometimes sat in the late afternoon when the main work was done and the light was going amber and the whole garden smelled of what it had been given that day. Ngozi had seen him with it every day of her 3 years in the compound. She had asked him once, passing him on her way to the kitchen with a tray of things, what he was reading. He had looked up at her with those settled eyes and said, without any performance of piety, simply and directly, the parts that keep me honest. She had laughed. He had smiled. The smile rearranged his whole face, the way a slow sunrise rearranges a landscape. She had carried the warmth of it into the kitchen, and it had lasted most of the morning. That was how it was between them. Small things. The accumulation of small things, which is, in the end, how all true things are built. She had noticed, in those 3 years, that the other staff liked Baba Theo the way you like something that has been part of the landscape long enough to feel necessary. The younger gardeners came to him with questions about soil and pests and the timing of planting, and he answered without making them feel foolish for not already knowing. The house girls brought him food sometimes without being asked to, which was its own form of language. Mrs. Amma, the head housekeeper, who ran the interior of the compound with the combination of warmth and absolute authority that the job required, always greeted Baba Theo first when she arrived in the morning, before anyone else, which Ngozi had noticed and marked. And then there was the way the compound's owner treated him. Not cruelly. Adewale Osei-Mensah did not treat Baba Theo cruelly. He treated him, on the rare occasions when their paths crossed in the compound, with the pleasant impersonal efficiency that powerful men use with the people whose names they have not quite committed to memory. A nod, and occasionally issued instruction about the appearance of the front garden before a visitor arrived. Once, that Ngozi had witnessed, a brief word of acknowledgement when the plumeria bloomed particularly well one morning, delivered while Mr. Osei-Mensah was walking to his car with his phone against his ear, so that it landed somewhere in the general direction of the garden without quite arriving. Baba Theo received all of it the same way. He received the acknowledgement and the indifference and the occasional instruction with the same quality of equanimity, which was not resignation. Ngozi had been watching long enough to know the difference, but something more deliberate. Something that came from a man who had decided, at some point in his 7 decades, what he was doing here and why, and who therefore did not need the world to reflect that purpose back at him to continue holding it. The morning the consultant's decisions were carried out, it was a Thursday. Ngozi knew it was Thursday because Thursday was the day the fresh produce was delivered from the market supplier, which meant she was at the compound gate at 6:30 to receive and check the delivery, standing in the early morning air with her clipboard and her pen and the specific alertness of someone who had learned that the supplier left things out or substituted inferior items when he thought no one was paying close enough attention. She was counting tomatoes when the black car arrived. It was not Mr. Osei-Mensah's car, which was larger and darker and had a driver who held the door. This was the consultant's car, a medium-sized silver thing that pulled into the compound with a confidence that left no room for the possibility of hesitation. The consultant, Kofi Asante Brew, stepped out in his suit and his shoes that made a particular sound on the paved driveway, a click that was designed to be heard. He went inside. Ngozi counted tomatoes. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Amma came out of the house with her lips pressed in a line so thin it was barely a line at all, which was Mrs. Ama's face for situations she had no control over and was managing herself through by the exercise of an enormous internal discipline. She walked to the garden shed. She spoke to someone inside for several minutes. Then she walked back to the house without looking at Ngozi, which was unusual, because Mrs. Ama always acknowledged Ngozi when they were in the same outdoor space. Ngozi finished with the tomatoes. She signed the delivery sheet. She sent the supplier's boy on his way. She was carrying the crate of tomatoes toward the kitchen when she saw Baba Theo come out of the garden shed. He was moving slowly, not the deliberate slow of his usual movement, the unhurried pace of a man who knew that everything worth doing had its own correct speed. This was a different kind of slow. The slow of a man receiving news while still standing up, still requiring his legs to carry him, while his interior was doing something that his exterior had not yet fully processed. He was holding his Bible against his chest. He was looking at the garden. He stood at the entrance to the shed and he looked at the garden the way you look at something you are leaving. Not dramatically, not in the way of performances of emotion, but with the particular quality of a man who has lived long enough to know that some departures cannot be undone, and that the right response to them is not rage or demonstration but stillness. A full witness to the moment. An honest farewell. Ngozi set the crate down very slowly. The rest of it she learned later from Mrs. Ama, who gave her the facts in precise sequence with the expression of a woman delivering a medical report about something she had not been able to prevent and was still deciding how to feel about. The consultant's recommendations had been implemented as of this morning. 7 positions. Baba Theo's was among them. The garden maintenance going forward would be handled by a landscaping company that had been contracted at a fixed quarterly rate, which represented a saving of 43% over the current arrangement. That was how it was put. A saving. Someone had instructed, in the course of the morning's proceedings, that Baba Theo's belongings from the garden shed were to be cleared. The shed contained, along with the tools and the seedling trays and the carefully labeled bags of fertilizer, a small wooden shelf that Baba Theo had built himself from off-cut timber, on which he kept a tin cup, a pair of gardening gloves that he replaced every year, a photograph in a cracked frame, and his Bible. These items had been placed in a cardboard box. Ngozi was in the kitchen when she heard the sound. She would not have been able to say what the sound was exactly. Something dropped. Something placed. She looked up from the pot she was stirring and looked at the window that faced the side path. She put down the ladle. She walked to the door. The cardboard box was sitting beside the refuse bin near the side entrance, the large black wheelie bin where the compound's daily waste went before collection. The box was open at the top. She could see the rim of the tin cup, the edge of the photograph frame, the worn brown cover of the Bible. The Bible was in the rubbish box. She stood very still for a moment. She looked toward the garden. Baba Theo was still there, standing near the eastern wall, his back to the compound house, looking at the plumeria trees he had planted and grown and tended for the past 15 years. From the set of his shoulders and the stillness of him, it was clear he had not yet turned around. He did not know what had been done with his things. The consultant's car started its engine somewhere on the other side of the house. Ngozi looked at the box again. The Bible, the photograph, the tin cup. She thought about the shelf Baba Theo had built himself. The care of its construction, the small neat brackets he had fashioned from scraps of metal, the level deliberateness of its installation on the shed wall. She thought about the way he sat with the Bible in the late afternoon with the amber light on it, not performing anything, just being with it. She thought about the margin notes she had once glimpsed when he left it open on the wall near the plumeria, the tiny handwriting in 3 colors filling every white space as though the book had been in conversation with him his entire life. She crossed the path in 7 steps. She reached into the box. She lifted the Bible out. It was heavier than she expected. Not physically, it was not a large book, but in the hands it had a density, the density of something that has been held for a long time by the same hands, that has absorbed the warmth and the hours and the private weight of a single human life until it carries that weight forward even when it is put down. She stood there with it in both hands. She was going to walk to Baba Theo. She was going to give it to him before he turned around and saw the box. That was the entire thought in her mind, simple and complete. There was no calculation in it, No consideration of what anyone might think or what it might cost her to insert herself into a situation that the management had already decided on. There was only the Bible and the man standing by the plumeria trees and the simple human arithmetic of the moment. She was already walking. She had taken 3 steps toward the eastern wall when the book slipped in her grip, not falling, just shifting, and she adjusted her hold, and in adjusting, her thumb caught the inside back cover where the pages met the worn leather, and she felt something that was not a page. She stopped walking. She looked down. There was something tucked between the last page and the back cover of the Bible. Folded small, folded carefully, folded the way you fold something you intend to keep, not to use immediately but to keep. The paper was old. Not ancient, but old. The kind of old that comes from years in a drawer or a pocket or the back of a well-loved book. Yellowed at the fold lines. The texture changed from crisp to something softer and more fragile. She did not open it. She stood on the path with the Bible in both hands and the folded letter inside it and the garden quiet around her, and she looked at it for a moment the way you look at something that you sense, without being able to say why, is not yours to look at yet. Not never. Just not yet. She started walking again. Baba Theo heard her footsteps on the path and turned. He looked at her. He looked at what she was carrying. Something moved through his face that was very fast and then very still, like a flame in a draft that rights itself before you can be certain it was ever disturbed. His eyes went to the Bible and back to her face, and what she saw in them was not the thing she might have expected in a man who had just been told, after 22 years, that his services were no longer required. It was not bitterness. It was not the particular wounded pride of someone who has been reduced to an accounting line. What she saw in his eyes, briefly and honestly, was gratitude. She held the Bible out to him. He did not take it immediately. He looked at her for a moment first, this young woman standing in the garden with his life's book in her hands, her face entirely open, not performing kindness, not making a gesture of it, simply returning to him what was his because it had not occurred to her to do otherwise. He said quietly, "My daughter." He had never called her that before. He called her Ngozi. He had always called her Ngozi, her name, which was already something because there were people on the compound staff who simply never learned names, for whom everyone was addressed by their function. My daughter. She felt those 2 words land somewhere in her chest that was not entirely prepared for them. He reached out and took the Bible from her. His large worn hands wrapped around it with the complete naturalness of something returning to its correct place. He looked down at it for a moment. He smoothed his thumb across the worn cover. Then he looked up at her and the slow sunrise of his smile came, slower than usual this time, arriving through something heavier than usual, but arriving. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She opened her mouth to say something about the box, something about the items still inside it, the tin cup and the photograph. But before she could find the words, he said, gently and without any weight of reproach, "I know about the box." She closed her mouth. He said, "I have been here long enough to know how these mornings go." He looked at the compound house, at its white walls and high windows and the veranda running its full length. His eyes traveled it with the look of a man who is seeing something with complete clarity and no particular bitterness, seeing it simply for what it is. "I planted those trees," he said. He gestured toward the plumeria with his chin, the slow movement of a man who does not require large expressions. Planted them and grew them and spoke to them through 3 dry seasons. He was quiet for a moment. "They will be here long after both of us are something other than what we are today." Ngozi did not know what to say to this. Sometimes there is nothing to say that would not diminish the thing being said, and the correct response is simply to remain. She remained. He tucked the Bible under his arm. He looked at her with those settled eyes. "You are a good person, Ngozi," he said. Not as a compliment exactly, as a statement of fact, offered in the straightforward way of someone reporting an observation they consider reliable. She felt that, in the same place the 2 words had landed before. The morning moved around them. The birds had decided the sky was ready some time ago and were proceeding accordingly. Somewhere inside the house, a door closed. The generator hummed its constant note. The plumeria moved its heavy flowers very slightly in a breath of air. Baba Theo said, "I should go and speak with Mrs. Amma. She will want to give me certain things, the Provident Fund papers, the formal letter." She is a woman who does things correctly even when the things being done are not entirely correct. He said this without irony, as a genuine piece of respect. He began to walk toward the house. He had taken 4 steps when he stopped. He turned back to Ngozi, who had not yet moved from the spot where they had been standing. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was slightly different from all the ways he had looked at her in 3 years of small mornings and shared paths through the compound garden. It was not the gentle, settled look of a familiar colleague. It was the look of a man who is deciding whether to offer something he has been carrying for a long time, who is weighing the moment against the need and finding the moment sufficient. He reached into the Bible. He found the folded paper that Ngozi had felt beneath her thumb without opening. He looked at it for a moment. He held it with both hands, turned it once, looked at it as you look at something you have looked at so many times that looking at it is itself a form of memory. Then he looked at Ngozi. He said, "If anything ever happens to me." His voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness there was a note she could not immediately name, a note she had heard somewhere before in this life, in the voices of people who were carrying something they had carried alone for long enough that the weight of it had become indistinguishable from themselves. "If anything ever happens to me, and you find this, you read it." He held it out to her. She did not move. He said quietly and firmly, "Take it." She took it. He nodded once. The nod of a man who has finished a long task and set it down correctly. Then he walked toward the house to find Mrs. Amma and do the final things correctly. Ngozi stood in the garden. She looked at the folded paper in her hands. It was not sealed. It had never been sealed. The fold had been done by hand and was held by the pressure of years between the pages of the Bible. The paper was warm from where it had been. She could feel the warmth of it against her palms. She did not open it yet. She stood in the garden with the morning moving forward around her and looked at the White House and its high windows and the veranda and the paved driveway where the consultant's silver car had already gone. She thought about 22 years. She thought about a shelf built from off-cut timber. She thought about a man standing by his plumeria trees looking at them the way you look at something that is yours in a way that has nothing to do with any piece of paper. She thought about the way he had said, "If anything ever happens to me." She looked at the folded paper. She carefully, slowly unfolded it. The handwriting inside was Baba Theo's. She recognized it from the margins she had glimpsed before, the same small careful hand, the same 3 colors of ink, though this was written in one, black, steady, the lines spaced with the deliberateness of something that had been composed over time rather than written in a single sitting. It was addressed to someone. She read the first line. She read it again. She stood completely still for a long moment. Then she read the rest of it slowly, holding every word the way you hold something that you understand, even as you are reading, is going to change the shape of everything you thought you knew about the ground beneath your feet. By the time she finished, the sun had moved a full hand's width up the sky. She folded the paper again. She folded it exactly as it had been, along the same worn creases, returning it to the shape it had held for years inside a worn Bible in a garden shed in the compound of a man who did not yet know what she was holding. She stood there for a long time. Then she walked to the kitchen. She picked up her ladle. She returned to the pot. But she was not thinking about the soup. She was thinking about the name on the first line of the letter. She was thinking about what the letter said. She was thinking about 22 years of a man bending to the earth of this compound, planting and tending and growing, and the real reason, a reason she was now holding folded in the pocket of her work apron, that he had come here at all. And she was thinking about the man in the White House with the marble floors, about what he did not know, about what it was going to mean for him when he found out. She stirred the soup. The morning moved forward. And somewhere in the compound, in the large study with the leather chairs and the desk where decisions were made between phone calls, Adewale Osei-Mensah sat with his laptop open and his phone quiet for a moment. And he was not thinking about Baba Theo or the Bible or the garden shed or any of it. He was not thinking about any of it at all. Not yet. She stirred the soup for a long time without tasting it. This is a thing that happens to people who have received information that is too large for the mind to hold all at once. The body continues its tasks. The hands keep moving. The eyes stay open. But the interior of the person has gone somewhere else entirely, to the place where large things are turned over and examined and slowly begin to be understood. Ngozi stirred the soup. She thought about the letter. She had read it twice, standing in the garden with the sun moving overhead and the compound going about its morning business around her. She had read it the way you read something that keeps rearranging itself as you go, where the sentence you just finished changes the meaning of the sentence before it, so that by the time you reach the end you must go back to the beginning and read the whole thing again with new eyes. The letter was addressed to a woman named Akojua. "My dear daughter," it began, in the careful handwriting that Ngozi now knew was Baba Theo's, in the black ink that meant it was written more recently than some of the older entries she had glimpsed in the Bible's margins. "My dear daughter, there are things I have carried for 38 years without speaking them aloud, and I am writing them now not because I expect you to act on them, but because a man should not leave this world having kept his whole story only to himself. That is a kind of theft from the people who loved him." She remembered the weight of each line as she had read it, standing in the garden. What the letter said was this: 38 years ago, Baba Theo was a young man farming a small plot of land that had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. The land was in a village 2 hours east of the city, not large but good, the kind of soil that rewarded care. He grew yam and cassava, and a portion of the plot he used for vegetables that his wife took to the market on Tuesdays. They had one child, Kojua. She was 4 years old. Life was not easy, but it had shape. It had the shape of a life being built carefully with honest hands, which is its own kind of dignity. In that year, a man came through the village. His name was Adewale Osei-Mensah. He was passing through on the route from the eastern markets to the city. He had a plan for a business that everyone he told it to had called too ambitious, which is what people with limited imagination say about things they cannot picture themselves doing. He had almost no money. He had an extraordinary talent for numbers and for reading what people needed before they knew they needed it. What he lacked was the starting capital. He and Baba Theo met at a roadside stall where both of them stopped to eat. Baba Theo had always been the kind of man who spoke to strangers with the ease of someone who had never learned to treat unknown people as threats. They talked for 2 hours over food. Adewale told him his plan with the complete and unguarded frankness of a man who had been turned away so many times that he had stopped managing his own vulnerability. Baba Theo listened with the complete presence that was, even then, the most essential thing about him. At the end of those 2 hours, Baba Theo went home. He spoke with his wife that night. He spoke with her for a long time. His wife's name had been Grace, and she had the kind of mind that cut through sentiment to practicality without losing warmth, which is a rare combination and a valuable one in a partner. She listened to everything he said. She asked him how much. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If you believe in this man, Theo, then I believe in you believing in him. That is what we have. That is what I give you." The following morning, Baba Theo went to the city. He liquidated everything they had. The savings from 4 years of farming. The money set aside for repairs to the house. The small amount they had been putting away since Akojua was born for the day she would need school fees. And then, because that was not quite enough, he went to a trader he knew in the market and sold the use of the eastern quarter of the plot for 1 growing season. He brought the money to Adewale Osei-Mensah. Adewale looked at what was in front of him. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Theo, this is everything you have." Baba Theo said, "Yes." Adewale said, "I will return every coin of this to you within 3 years. I give you my word as a man." Baba Theo said, "I know you will. I am not worried about the money. I am worried about the journey. Go and do it right." Adewale went to the city and opened his stall. Within a year, the stall had become 2 stalls. Within 3 years, he had a proper shop. Within 7 years, he had a building. The business grew the way certain things grow when the person tending them has a genuine gift for it and the conditions are finally right, rapidly, almost startlingly, outpacing even the projections of the man himself. He did not return the money in 3 years. He did not return it in 5. Life moved fast, as life does for people in the middle of building something. There were always reasons, always the next stage requiring the available capital, always the sense that the return would be more meaningful once the business had reached a certain point. Adewale sent word when he could. He sent small gifts. He told Baba Theo that the money was safe and the promise was safe and to have patience. Baba Theo had patience. Baba Theo had more patience than most men are issued in a lifetime. The years moved. Kojua grew. The plot of land sustained them through seasons that were good and seasons that were not. Baba Theo's wife, Grace, became sick when Kojua was 12, a sickness of the chest that the village medicine man treated with herbs and prayer, and that the city hospital, when they finally got her there, treated with things that cost money they did not easily have. She recovered. But she was fragile afterward, and the fragility was permanent, and the cost of managing it was a weight added to weights already being carried. Emmanuel, in those years, was becoming the kind of man whose name people said with a particular quality of respect and slight awe. The business was not a stall anymore. It was not a shop anymore. It was something that required accountants and a lawyer and a second vehicle. He had a house now, a real one, in a part of the city where such houses meant something. He sent Baba Theo money occasionally. Not the amount owed. Never the full amount. Installments, or what he called installments, sums that felt like acknowledgement without being restitution. Each time he sent them, he sent a message that the full repayment was coming, that things were nearly settled, that patience was the virtue required. Baba Theo received each sum and each message with the same equanimity he brought to everything. He did not pursue. He did not demand. His wife would sometimes ask, gently, whether Emmanuel had been in contact, and he would tell her yes, and she would nod, and neither of them would say the thing they were both thinking because some thoughts, once spoken, make the room too small. Then Adewale Osei-Mensah fell ill. He was 61 years old. The illness came the way such things come to men who have spent decades moving at the speed that Emmanuel moved, suddenly and with a thoroughness that could not be negotiated with. He was in the hospital for 4 months. His son, Adewale, was running the business by then, running it well, but the medical costs were significant and the family's assets were tied up in the kind of investments that are not liquid and cannot be easily accessed without consequence. Baba Theo heard about Emmanuel's illness through a chain of people that connected the city to the village in the way that important news always travels faster than ordinary information. He traveled to the city. He went to the hospital. He sat with Emmanuel for 2 hours. Emmanuel looked at him from the hospital bed with eyes that carried, alongside the illness, something that had been accumulating for 30 years and had never been adequately addressed. He said, "Theo." Baba Theo said, "I am here." Emmanuel said, "I am sorry." Baba Theo said, "I know." Emmanuel said, "I will tell Adewale everything. When I am better, I will sit with my son and I will tell him the whole story and he will do right by you. That is my promise." Baba Theo looked at this man he had believed in 30 years ago when no one else had, this man who had built something extraordinary on a foundation that included the entirety of everything Baba Theo had possessed at the age of 30, and he said, "Do not worry about me, Emmanuel. Worry about getting well." Then he went to the hospital administrator's office. He paid what was required for Emmanuel's care for the following month. Not from reserves, he had no reserves. He borrowed from his daughter's husband. He sold the last quarter of his father's plot of land. He paid what was required because a man he had once believed in was lying in a hospital bed, and there was something he could do about it. He did this twice more before Emmanuel died. Emmanuel died in his 4th month of illness, which was 2 weeks before his discharge date, which was a cruelty of timing that these things sometimes deliver. He died without telling Adewale, whether because he lost the time, or because he could not find the words, or because some private shame had made the conversation too difficult to begin, the letter could not say. What the letter said was that Baba Theo believed Emmanuel had intended to keep that last promise. He believed it because he had known the man for 35 years, and because believing it was the only way to carry what came next without bitterness. What came next was this. Baba Theo waited. He waited for Adewale to reach out. He waited through the year of mourning and the year of business reorganization and the year in which the compound was expanded and the marble floors were installed. He waited and the contact did not come, because Adewale did not know to make it, because his father had taken the story with him. After 3 years of waiting, Baba Theo came to the compound himself. Not to demand. Not to confront. He had thought about it for a long time, and what he had decided was this. He would come, he would work, he would be present, and he would wait for the right moment to speak. He would give Adewale the chance to be the kind of man his father had promised he was. He would give the story the chance to find its own resolution. He had been waiting for 22 more years. The right moment had never come. Or perhaps it had come many times and he had let it pass, because the longer you wait for something the harder it becomes to believe the moment has arrived, and perhaps also because there is a quality of pride that belongs specifically to people who have been generous, a pride that cannot bring itself to say, "I gave you something. Did you know? Did it matter?" The letter said, "I do not write this so that you will go to Adewale Osei-Mensah and present him with a bill. I do not write this so that anyone will go and demand what was owed. I am an old man and the years that money would have changed are behind me. What I write this for is so that you know, Akojua, that your father did not spend his life poorly. He gave something real to someone real, and that something grew into a great tree. Perhaps the man sitting in the shade of that tree does not know who planted the first seed. Perhaps he will never know. But God knows. And your father knows. And now you will know." And then, at the very end, one more thing. One sentence, added in a slightly different pressure of the pen, as though it had been written at a different sitting after a gap of time, said, "I have left a letter for the boy also. It is with a person I trust to give it when the time is right. I do not know when the time is right, but I believe it will become clear." Ngozi stood at the kitchen counter. The soup was boiling now, which it had not been when she last paid attention to it. She turned the flame down. She pressed both hands flat on the counter and looked at the tiled wall in front of her and breathed. "The person I trust." She was the person he trusted. She looked down at her apron pocket, at the slight square outline of the folded letter showing through the fabric. She thought about what Baba Theo had said in the garden. "If anything ever happens to me, and you find this, you read it." He had not said if anything ever happens. He had said when anything ever happens. He had given it to her this morning on his last day, on the morning of his dismissal, which meant he had understood this morning to be the moment. He had been carrying it for however long, waiting for the right person in the right moment, and when Ngozi walked across the path and held out his Bible to him with no calculation and no performance and no agenda beyond the simple human arithmetic of returning what was his, something in him had settled. She was the person. This knowledge sat in her chest with a weight she was not sure she knew how to carry. Because carrying it in one direction was the letter for Adewale, which she did not yet have. Baba Theo had spoken of it. A letter for the boy. Where was it? She had not seen a second letter in the Bible. She had felt only the one folded paper beneath her thumb. Was there a second letter somewhere? Had he taken it with him? Had it been in the box that was now sitting next to the refuse bin, the box with the tin cup and the photograph frame? She turned from the counter. She walked to the side entrance. The box was still there. The compound's waste collection was not until Friday, which meant it had not been touched. She looked through it carefully. The tin cup, the photograph in the cracked frame, a woman and a younger man, Baba. Theo at perhaps 40 with someone she could only assume was his wife, Grace. Both of them looking at whoever was holding the camera with the relaxed and unself-conscious expression of people who did not know this photograph would one day be important. Pair of worn gardening gloves. 3 seed packets, labeled in Baba Theo's handwriting. And at the bottom of the box, beneath a folded cloth, a small envelope. Not sealed. The flap was simply folded over, the way you close a letter you expect to open again. On the front of the envelope, in the same careful hand, 2 words. Adewale. Only. She picked it up. She held both letters now, one in each hand, the letter for Akojua and the letter for Adewale, and she stood by the refuse bin in the side path of the compound with the morning sun warming the back of her neck, and she understood with complete clarity what Baba Theo had intended. He had given her the letter for the daughter so that she would understand the story. He had left the letter for the son so that she could decide what to do with it. He had made her the keeper of both. If this story has found its way into your heart, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale from Village Heart. Your support is what keeps the fire burning, and more stories like this one coming your way. The question of what to do with the letter for Adewale was not simple. Ngozi was a kitchen worker. She earned a wage that she had negotiated up carefully and twice, over 3 years, and which was still not enough but was closer to enough than it had been. She lived in 2 rooms with her mother and 2 brothers. She had no savings because savings required a surplus and there had never been a surplus. She was 24 years old and she had learned, through the specific education that life on tight margins provides, that people like her did not interrupt people like Adewale Osei-Mensah with stories. That was not how the world was arranged. The world was arranged so that people like her received instructions and carried them out and, if they were fortunate, were noticed for carrying them out well, and if they were very fortunate, kept their positions when the consultant came. She thought about this. She also thought about a man planting plumeria trees in someone else's garden for 22 years. She thought about the soil he had carried and the water he had measured and the mornings he had spent on his knees in the ground of a compound that his money had helped build, while the man inside it ate his single breakfast at one end of a 12-person table and did not quite remember his name. She tucked the letter for Adewale into her other apron pocket and went back to the kitchen. She would go to Mrs. Ama. Mrs. Ama was in her office, a small room off the main corridor where the household records were kept, where she conducted the quiet administrative work of running a large compound with the disciplined care of someone who understood that a household this size required the same systems and the same attention to detail as any other enterprise, regardless of what the world assumed about domestic labor. The door was open. She was writing. She looked up when Ngozi knocked on the frame. Ngozi came in and closed the door behind her. Mrs. Ama looked at the closed door. She looked at Ngozi's face. She set her pen down. She said, "Sit." Ngozi sat. She told Mrs. Ama everything. She told her about the box by the refuse bin and the Bible and retrieving it and Baba Theo in the garden. She told her about the letter Baba Theo had given her to keep. She did not read it aloud. She simply told Mrs. Ama what it contained. Sitting in the chair across from the desk with her hands in her lap and her voice steady, the voice she used when she was saying something true that she needed the other person to actually hear. Mrs. Ama listened without interrupting. This was one of her gifts. She heard everything, the events and the spaces between the events, and she waited until the telling was fully done before she responded. When Ngozi finished, Mrs. Ama was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the desk. She pressed her lips together in the thin line that meant she was managing something large internally. Then she looked up. She said, "Did you know that when Baba Theo first came to this compound, the late Mr. Osei-Mensah came out to meet him personally?" Ngozi shook her head. Mrs. Ama said, "I was not here then, I came later. But Auntie Efua, who was head housekeeper before me, she told me. She said the late Mr. Osei-Mensah walked out into the driveway when Baba Theo arrived and shook his hand with both hands, the way you greet someone who is not staff but someone you receive. She said the two of them stood in the driveway talking for almost an hour before anyone showed Baba Theo to the shed. She said she had never seen the late Mr. Osei-Mensah stand in a driveway for an hour for any person." She paused. She said, "I did not understand what that meant until just now." Ngozi felt something move through the room. The quality of the air shifted slightly, the way it does when a thing that has been underground finally surfaces. Mrs. Ama said, "Where is Baba Theo now?" Ngozi said she did not know. He had come in to collect his papers and then he had gone. Mrs. Ama nodded slowly. She looked at the desk again. She said, "He has a room on Okafor Lane, I believe, near the old water tower. He has been there for many years. He never moved because he spent so little time there." She pressed her lips together again. "He told me once that he liked the compound better than his room because at least here there was something growing." The something growing. 22 years of something growing. Mrs. Ama said, "The letter for Adewale. You need to give it to him." Ngozi said, "I know. But how?" Mrs. Ama looked at her with the expression of a woman who has navigated the hierarchies of large households long enough to know exactly which channels existed and which ones were effective and which ones could be used carefully and which ones, if misused, would make the person trying to use them invisible in a way they did not want to be invisible. She said, "Give it to me. I will put it in the morning correspondence." Ngozi looked at her. Mrs. Ama said, "Mr. Osei-Mensah reads every piece of correspondence that comes to this house himself before it goes to his office. It is a habit his father had. He kept it. The morning correspondence goes on the desk in the study at 7:30. Ngozi said, "What if he throws it away without reading it? What if he sees there is no sender and assumes it is nothing?" Mrs. Ama thought about this. She said, "We write something on the outside." She pulled a fresh envelope from her desk drawer. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she wrote on the front of the envelope, In her precise housekeeper's hand, 3 words. About your father. She held the envelope out to Ngozi. Ngozi took the letter from her apron pocket, the one addressed in Baba Theo's hand to Adewale only, and she placed it inside the fresh envelope. Then she handed the envelope back to Mrs. Ama, who sealed it, who set it on the desk in front of her with the deliberateness of someone completing an action they understand to be significant. They looked at each other. Mrs. Ama said, "Now we wait." Ngozi went back to the kitchen. She finished the soup. She prepared the rest of the morning's food. She moved through the kitchen tasks with her body while her mind turned the whole situation over slowly, examining it from every angle the way you examine a thing you have never seen before and must understand completely before you can respond to it correctly. She thought about Adewale eating his single breakfast at one end of the long table. She thought about the late Adewale Osei-Mensah dying with a promise unkept and a story untold. She thought about Baba Theo's daughter, Akojua, somewhere she did not know, living in a life that had been shaped by a debt that was never repaid and a grace that was never acknowledged. She thought about 22 years of a man bending to the earth of a compound that his money had helped build, waiting for a right moment that the other man never gave him enough attention to provide. She thought about the plumeria trees. She thought, those trees are older than anything else growing in this compound. They were planted by the man who has just been driven out in the morning. They will bloom again in 3 months, and when they do, the man sitting in the house will walk past them and perhaps smell them, and he will not know. At 10 minutes past 7, she watched through the kitchen window as Mrs. Ama walked down the main corridor with a small stack of envelopes, moving with her usual purpose, without the slightest alteration in pace or expression. She turned left at the corridor end, toward the study. At 7:20, Ngozi heard the sound of Adewale's shoes on the marble floor above her. His morning movement from bedroom to bathroom to dressing room followed a pattern she had learned without trying to learn it, the way you absorb the rhythms of any place you inhabit daily. He would be in the study by 7:35. She peeled potatoes. She listened. At 7:47, she heard nothing unusual. At 7:59, she heard a chair move, the specific sound of a heavy chair being pushed back suddenly on a marble floor. Not gradually, suddenly. The sound of a person who has stood up from a seated position with speed. Then nothing. Then, after a long pause, footsteps in the corridor above, moving quickly, then on the stairs, then through the lower corridor. Ngozi stood completely still at the kitchen counter. The footsteps passed the kitchen door without pausing. Then they stopped. Then they came back. The kitchen door opened. Adewale Osei-Mensah was standing in the doorway of the kitchen in his work clothes, his jacket not yet on, his collar open, holding the envelope in one hand. The morning light from the window behind Ngozi fell across him, and what she saw on his face was not what she had expected. She had thought she would see anger, or denial, the particular blankness of a powerful man who has been confronted with something inconvenient and is deciding how to reclassify it as less important than it is. What she saw was neither of those things. His face was not blank. His face was open in the way that a face opens when something has hit the interior of a person hard enough to knock down the structure they maintain between themselves and the world, and the structure has gone down too fast to be rebuilt before someone sees. His eyes were moving, the particular rapid movement of a person whose mind is processing faster than any external thing can keep pace with. He was looking at her. He said, "Who gave this to me?" Ngozi said, "Mrs. Ama put it in the correspondence." "But it was not from Mrs. Ama." He said, "Where did it come from?" She said, "Baba Theo left it." Something happened in his face. Something that was very fast and very still, like a flame in a draft. He said, "Theophilus, the gardener." The way he said it told her 2 things at once. That he knew Baba Theo's full name, which meant he was not as indifferent to the staff as he appeared to be, or at least that this particular name had registered at some point. And that, until this morning, the gardener had been exactly and only that to him. The gardener. Ngozi said, "Yes." He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He said, "How much of this did you know? Did you read this?" She said carefully, "He gave me something to read so that I would understand what I was carrying. He left this one for you separately. I did not read yours." He looked at her. The kind of looking that is actually an assessment, not hostile but genuinely measuring, the look of a man who is trying to determine the trustworthiness of the person in front of him and knows that the assessment matters. He said, "What did your letter tell you?" She said, "It told me the story." He said, "What story?" She took a breath. She looked at this man standing in her kitchen doorway, this man with his marble floors and his 7 acres and his business in 14 countries and his single breakfast at one end of a table meant for 12, and she understood that what she was about to say to him was something that nobody had ever said to him. Not because they did not know, but because he had not been the kind of man who people walked toward with true things, and that this made it lonelier and more necessary at the same time. She said, "The story of how your father got his start, and who gave it to him, and what that cost, and how the man it cost spent the last 22 years of his working life inside this compound, waiting for a conversation that never came." Adewale was very still. Ngozi said, "It is all in your letter. I believe he explains it better than I can." He looked at the envelope in his hand. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "He was here this morning. He was here and then he was gone." She said, "Yes." He said, "I approved the list on a Tuesday. Between calls. There were 7 names and I approved them and his was on it and I did not." He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. The end of it was clear enough without finishing. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the envelope in his hand and the open collar and the face that had come undone. And he was not, in this moment, the man who sat in glass-roomed offices in London or approved efficiency reports between phone calls. He was something more elemental than that. A man who has just learned that the ground beneath his feet is different from what he believed it to be, and who is standing very still because the floor might be the next thing to change. He said quietly and with a directness that surprised her, "Is he a good man? Baba Theo, in your experience of him, is he a good man?" She looked at Adewale. She thought about 3 years of small mornings. She thought about a slow smile that rearranged a whole face. She thought about the parts that keep me honest. She thought about a man standing by his plumeria trees looking at them the way you look at something that is yours in a way no paper can grant or remove. She said, "He is the best man I have met in this compound." The sentence was not sharp. It was not an accusation. She said it the way you say something true plainly, because the plainness is the thing that makes it land. Adewale received it. She could see him receive it. He did not flinch, but something behind his eyes absorbed the impact of it with the deliberateness of a man who has decided he will not look away from this, whatever the cost of looking. He said, "Do you know where he has gone?" She said, "Mrs. Amma may have an address." He nodded. He looked at the envelope one more time. Then he said something she did not expect. He said, "Why did you go and retrieve the Bible from the box this morning? Why did you do that?" She thought about it. She thought about the worn cover and the margined pages and the warmth of it in her hands. She thought about Baba Theo standing by the plumeria trees and not knowing yet what had been done with his things. She said, "Because it was his. Because it should not be in the rubbish. Because," she paused, "because nobody in this compound was going to do it if I didn't." He held her gaze. This time it was not an assessment. It was something else. The particular way of looking that people use when they have just met someone and understood, in the way that true things are understood suddenly and completely, exactly who that person is. He said, "Thank you." Then he turned and walked back down the corridor. She heard him take the stairs with purpose. She heard the study door close. She stood in the kitchen. After a long moment, she turned back to the counter. She peeled the last potato. Then she stopped peeling. She set the potato down. She pressed both hands flat on the counter and looked at the tiled wall and thought about what was happening in the study above her. She thought about a man reading a letter. She thought about what it does to a person, truly does, to discover that the story they believed to be theirs was built on something they were never told. That the foundation of everything they had received was poured by hands they never acknowledged, by a person they saw every day without seeing. She thought about Baba Theo on Okafor Lane near the old water tower. She thought about a man sitting in a room he liked less than a garden because at least in the garden something was growing. She thought about his daughter Akojua, somewhere receiving wages from an old man who had been sending most of what he earned back to her for years, living on the remainder, which was not much, which was almost nothing. She thought about 22 years. She thought, is it too late? Is anything able to be repaired after 22 years of not seeing what was right in front of you? She did not know the answer, but she thought about her mother, lying in 2 rooms with a fan that only ran when the current was steady. She thought about the things that were not yet broken in her own life but would break without intervention. She thought about what it felt like to be standing on the edge of something you could not fix alone and needing someone to see you before the edge gave way. She thought, Baba Theo saw me this morning. He trusted me with the most important thing he carried. He did not see me as a kitchen girl with a clipboard and a bus to catch. He saw me as the person who would do the right thing. She thought, I am going to do the right thing. She picked up the potato. She did not know yet what the right thing was exactly. She did not know if Adewale would come out of that study a changed man or a defended one. She did not know if the letter would open something in him or if he would fold it back into its envelope and place it in a drawer where things went to be acknowledged without being acted upon. She did not know if Baba Theo was still findable. She did not know what finding him would look like, or what could be offered that would mean anything after this length of time. What she knew was this. She had stood at a crossroads this morning, early, before most people in the compound were thinking about crossroads, and she had walked across a path and picked up a Bible from a box next to a refuse bin, and in doing so she had set something in motion that she had not understood then and was only beginning to understand now. Some things, once set in motion, do not stop until they arrive at the place they were always going. She peeled the potato. She listened to the compound around her. Somewhere above her, in the study with the leather chairs, a man was sitting with a letter in his hands, and something was happening to him, and the sound of it, the sound of something cracking open that had been sealed too long, was not a sound you could hear with your ears. But Ngozi heard it anyway. She had always been good at hearing the things beneath the things. The door of the study opened at 9:43. She knew this because she had not stopped listening. Not through the rest of the potato preparation or through the beginning of the stew or through Mrs. Ama's quiet passage down the corridor on some other errand. Glancing at the study door as she passed with the same barely visible tension in her jaw that she had been carrying all morning. The footsteps came down the stairs. They came to the kitchen door. They stopped. She turned. Adewale was standing there again. He looked different from 45 minutes ago in a way that was hard to quantify and impossible to miss. He still had the open collar. He still had the jacket off. But the face was different. The face had been through something. The face of a man who has sat with a truth that cost him something and has not yet decided whether he will be enlarged by it or diminished by it, but who has, at minimum, been honest enough to sit with it. He said, I need to find him. Ngozi said, Mrs. Ama has an address on Okafor Lane. He said, will you come? She looked at him. He said, I do not know what to say to him. I have read the letter 3 times and I still do not know what to say to him. But you knew him. You knew the kind of man he was in his day-to-day, what he was actually like, not what a letter about him says. I need someone who knew him. She looked at this man, this billionaire standing in her kitchen doorway asking her to come with him, and she thought about all the ways this morning had been different from every other morning she had lived in this compound. She thought about Baba Theo handing her the letter in the garden with the slow sunrise of his smile. She thought about my daughter. She said, let me get my bag. He nodded. She untied her apron. She folded it over the back of the nearest chair. She picked up her bag from the hook near the door. And then the 2 of them, the billionaire and the kitchen worker, walked out of the compound together into the morning, toward a small room near the old water tower on Okafor Lane, and neither of them knew yet what they would find there. But Ngozi thought about the plumeria trees. She thought about how they bloomed whether or not anyone was watching. She thought about how that was the thing about goodness, when it was real, when it was the true kind that a man carries in his bones and not the performed kind that requires an audience. It grows in the dark. It grows in silence. It grows even when the person who planted it has been sent away from the garden. And then, at some point, it blooms, and the whole compound smells of it, whether the man in the house is ready for it or not. Okafor Lane was the kind of street that the city had not yet decided what to do with. It sat between a neighborhood being demolished for development and a neighborhood already developed, which meant it existed in a particular suspension, neither being torn down nor being improved, simply continuing in its original state while everything around it changed. The old water tower that Mrs. Amma had mentioned stood at the far end, rusted at the upper rim and covered at the base in vegetation that grows wherever human attention has not recently been, thick and unasked and entirely at ease with itself. The car stopped in front of a building that was 3 stories and the color of a wall that had once been painted and had since been rained on many times. There were flowers in a pot on the window ledge of the ground floor. Someone had put them there and was keeping them alive, which told you something about whoever lived behind that window that the building itself did not. Adewale looked at the building. He said nothing. Ngozi got out of the car first. She had been beside him for 20 minutes in a silence she did not try to fill. She understood this kind of silence. She had lived alongside variations of it her entire life, the silence of someone using a car window as a surface to think against. She knocked on the ground floor door. It opened after a moment and a woman looked out at them. She was perhaps 35, with a face that carried a tiredness that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of someone managing a difficult situation over a long period of time. She looked at Ngozi. She looked at Adewale behind Ngozi. Her eyes moved between them with the careful appraisal of someone who has learned not to open doors too wide until she knows what is on the other side. Ngozi said, "We are looking for Baba Theo. My name is Ngozi. I work at the Osei-Mensah compound. He knows me." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am Akojua." The word landed between them. Ngozi felt it land. Beside her she felt Adewale go very still. Akojua said, "My father came home this morning. He is resting." She looked at them. The assessment continued, slower now, going deeper. Then something in her eyes shifted, not opening entirely, but adjusting, the way a door adjusts on its hinge when the person behind it has not quite decided to close it. She said, "Come in." The room was small and clean in the way of rooms where someone has made the most of limited space with consistent care. There was a table near the window with 2 chairs. There was a shelf with books arranged with the same color-ordered logic Ngozi recognized from 3 years of watching Baba Theo tend his things. There was a cot behind a curtain in the corner, and from behind it came the sound of a man breathing in the slow rhythm of someone who has allowed himself, finally, to rest. Adewale looked around the room. He took in the shelf and the table and the 2 chairs and the curtain and the flowers on the window ledge. He looked at all of it with the complete focused attention of a man who understands that this is not a moment for comfortable abstractions, that this room is asking to be seen accurately. He looked at Akojua. He said, without preamble, "Your father gave everything he had to mine, and my father built his life on it and mine, and neither of them told you or me, and I approved a list on a Tuesday without thinking." His voice was controlled the way you control something that is moving, with effort, with the full weight of your attention applied to keeping the shape of it. He said, "I do not have the right words for what I came to say. I have been trying to find them since 9 this morning. But I cannot sit in that compound for another hour without being in this room." Akojua looked at him for a long time. Her face was not soft and not hard. It was the face of a woman who has spent years being the daughter of a story nobody else knew was a story, now watching the person that story was always moving toward arrive at her door without the language he needs. She finds she cannot hold this against him. She said, "Sit down." She went to the curtain. She spoke quietly. A pause. The slow sound of someone rising. Baba Theo came through the curtain. He had changed into a simple shirt and trousers, and he looked, in these ordinary clothes in this small room, both smaller and more complete than he had ever looked in the compound. The compound had been a context that reduced him. This room, with its shelf and its books and its daughter near the window, was a context in which he was entirely himself. He looked at Ngozi first. He said, "Ah." She said, "I found the second letter." He nodded slowly. He said, "I thought you would." Then he looked at Adewale. There was a long moment between them, a moment with the weight of 38 years in it. The weight of 2 men and their fathers and a debt and a grace that had outlasted the debt, that had outlasted everything except this morning. Adewale stood. He said, "I did not know." Baba Theo said, "I know you did not." Adewale said, "You were in my compound for 22 years. My father died without telling me. You came back and tended my garden and waited for me to know something I had no way of knowing. and I approved a list on a Tuesday. Baba Theo looked at him. He said very quietly, "Your father was not a bad man. He was a man who found it hard to say certain things. I knew this about him when I gave him the money, and I gave it anyway. Because you do not give to people because they are perfect. You give because the need is real and the giving is possible, and in that moment you are the person who can." Adewale looked at him. Baba Theo said, "I did not come back to the compound to punish him. I came because I wanted to see what grew from the seed. I wanted to see if it became something good. And it did." He paused. He looked at his hands. "Whatever he withheld from me, he gave to you. The seriousness and the work and the drive to build something that lasts. I watched you from the garden for 22 years, and I saw that what grew from what I gave him was worth the cost." The room was very quiet. Adewale said, "That does not make it right." Baba Theo said, "No, it does not." He said it simply, not to wound, not to forgive prematurely, because it was true, and in this room only true things were going to be of any use. Adewale looked at Akojua. He said, "What do you need? Not what can I offer. What do you need?" Akojua looked at him. She was quiet for a moment, deciding whether to be honest in front of this man, deciding whether the moment warranted it. She said, "My mother's medical costs have been my father's for the last 4 years. The treatment is monthly. My father has been sending most of his wages. We have nothing saved. When he stopped working today, I did not know what the end of the month was going to look like." She said it without drama. The way women who have managed difficult things for a long time say difficult things. Factually. Because the facts are enough. Adewale said, "That ends today." He said it with the same simplicity. Not as a grand gesture. As a correction. The tone of a man closing a debt that should never have been left open. He said, "I would like to do more than the medical costs if you will allow it. There is a matter that compounded across 38 years, and I want to address it completely. I have a lawyer I will call this afternoon. But I am asking your permission because this belongs to your family." Akojua looked at her father. Baba Theo said, "There is one thing." Adewale said, "Name it." Baba Theo said, "The land. My father's plot. I sold the last quarter to help pay for your father in the hospital. That land now has 3 houses on it, and I do not want those houses removed. But there was a promise before all of this that my father's land would stay in our family. That promise was lost somewhere in the rest of it. I would like my daughter and her children to have ground beneath their feet that cannot be taken." He said it without grandeur. The way a man asks for the thing he actually needs, which is rarely the thing people expect. Adewale said, "I will see to it." Baba Theo nodded once. The nod of a man who believes what he is hearing and is at peace with having heard it. Adewale sat down in the chair near the table. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at Baba Theo and said the thing that was not in the financial correction, not in the land or the medical costs, the thing that had no practical form but which was, in the end, the thing that had driven him out of the compound at 10 in the morning. He said, "I am sorry I did not see you. Every morning for 22 years you were in my garden and I did not see you. I am sorry." Baba Theo looked at him for a long time. Then the slow sunrise of the smile came. He said, "You see me now." 3 weeks later, there were changes at the compound that the staff noted and discussed quietly in the kitchen and in the corridors. The landscaping contract was cancelled. Adewale paid the penalty without discussion. Baba Theo did not return as an employee. This was his choice offered clearly. He was 71 years old and his back had made its position on daily kneeling plain enough. What he agreed to, after a conversation with Adewale that Ngozi was not present for but heard about from Mrs. Ama, who heard it from Adewale himself in the course of a household meeting he called and attended in person, which he had never done before, what Baba Theo agreed to was to come twice a week in the mornings to consult. That was the word they settled on. Consult. He would come and walk through the garden and tell the 2 younger gardeners what needed doing and how. Then he would sit on the bench near the plumeria trees and eat his lunch and, if Adewale was home, they would sometimes sit together in the garden and talk. Not about the debt. Not about the past. About the garden. about what was growing and what needed attention and what the soil was doing in this particular dry season and whether the plumeria would need anything before the rains. The way two men talk when they have cleared the thing between them and are learning what they actually have to say to each other. Ngozi watched this happen from the kitchen window in the mornings when she could. She watched Baba Theo move through the garden with the same unhurried pace, but lighter now, lighter in the way of a man who has put down something heavy and had his hands confirmed as hands worth listening to. She watched Adewale come out on the mornings Baba Theo was there. She watched him sit on the bench that had always been Baba Theo's bench. She watched him listen. She watched him learn how to listen, which is different from knowing how and which takes practice and which he was getting better at. One morning, 6 weeks after Okafor Lane, Adewale came into the kitchen. Not with papers or a phone or the purposeful energy of a man moving between tasks. He stood at the counter and asked Ngozi if she would like a cup of tea, which was not a sentence that had ever been said in that kitchen by anyone standing on his side of the room. She looked at him. He looked at the kettle with the mild, determined expression of a man who has decided to do a thing and will not be talked out of it. She said, "Yes, thank you." He made 2 cups and set one in front of her and said, "I have been thinking about what you did. The morning of the box. You had nothing to gain." She wrapped her hands around the cup. She said, "I had everything to gain. I just did not know it yet." He looked at her. He said, "I think my father would have liked you." She thought about a man she had never met who had made a promise he could not keep and died carrying the weight of it. She thought about all the ways people mean well and fall short and leave others to manage the distance. She thought about Baba Theo waiting in the garden for 22 years with the equanimity of someone who had decided that grace was not a response to being treated well but a posture you chose regardless. She said, "I think he would have liked Baba Theo too. I think he always did." Adewale looked at his cup. He said, "Yes, I think he did." Outside, the plumeria was in its 3rd month since the dismissal, which meant it was close to its season. The buds had been forming for 2 weeks, small and tight and holding everything they were about to become in a patience that required no one's attention to sustain it. By the end of the week they would open, and the whole compound would smell of them. And Baba Theo would come on Tuesday morning and he would see them and he would stand among them the way he always had, with his large worn hands and his settled eyes and the slow sunrise smile, and he would not say, "I planted these." He would not need to. He would simply stand in the garden that his life had helped build. And it would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be what it had always been, underneath all the years of not being seen. A gift given freely, growing still. Akojua came to the compound on a Saturday. She had not been invited. She had simply appeared at the gate on a morning when the plumeria was at the height of its season, when the whole eastern wall of the garden was a thing so alive with white and yellow and the faintest pink at the petal edges that even the guard at the booth had been caught twice that week standing at his post looking at it rather than at the road. Mrs. Amma brought her through. Ngozi saw them coming across the garden from the kitchen window, and she put down what was in her hands and went out. Akojua was walking slowly, not with hesitation, with intention. The walk of a person who is receiving something large and does not want to move through it too fast. She was looking at the garden the way her father looked at it, with that quality of attention that was not decorative but real, the eyes of someone who understood that a thing this alive had required a specific devotion that deserved to be acknowledged. She stopped at the plumeria trees. She stood there for a moment. She reached out and touched one of the lower blossoms with 2 fingers, the way you touch something you have heard about so many times that the reality of it is slightly astonishing. Then she turned to Ngozi. She said, "He talked about these trees." Ngozi said, "I know." Akojua said, "When we were children and money was difficult, which was most of the time, he used to tell us about the garden. Not with sadness. With a kind of pride that confused me when I was young because I did not understand what he had to be proud of. He was a gardener in another man's house. What was there to be proud of?" She looked at the trees again. She said, "I understand now. He was not proud of the position. He was proud of what he made. He was proud that he had given something ordinary the chance to become extraordinary. He felt about this garden the way he felt about us. That if you give something enough of the right kind of attention, it will become more than what it started as. Ngozi stood beside her under the plumeria and let the morning sit between them without filling it. After a while, Akosua said, "He told me about you." Ngozi said, "What did he say?" Akosua said, "He said you returned his Bible. He said you walked across the path when no one else did and you picked it up and brought it to him. He said the way you did it, without announcement, without making yourself the subject of the action, was the kind of thing his mother used to call true goodness, as distinct from performed goodness. He said he knew the moment you handed it to him that you were the right person." Ngozi looked at the blossoms. She thought about a morning that had started with peeling yam and thinking about her mother. She thought about how small the action had been. 7 steps across a path. A book lifted from a box. A man in a garden receiving what was his. She said, "I only did what was there to be done." Akosua looked at her. She said, "That is exactly what he said you would say." They both smiled at that, the particular smile of 2 women who have not known each other long but have recognized something in each other that makes length of acquaintance beside the point. Akosua said, "I wanted to come and see it. His garden. I wanted to stand in the place he gave 22 years to and understand it from the inside rather than from the stories." She paused. "Now that I am here, I think I understand something I could not understand from a distance." He was not waiting to be repaid. He stopped waiting for repayment a long time ago. What he was doing here was something else. Something I do not have a clean word for. Ngozi thought about it. She said he was witnessing. Akosua went still. Ngozi said he gave something and he wanted to see what it became. Not to own it. Not to reclaim it. Just to know that the giving had not been wasted. That the seed he put into the ground produced something real. Akosua looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Yes, that is the word. Witnessing." She turned back to the trees. She was not crying. She had the face of a woman who has already done most of the crying that this story required of her, over long years in a small room, and who is now in a different phase of it. The phase that comes after grief has finished its loudest work and left behind something more bearable and more permanent. She said, "He is planting new things, at home, in the yard behind the building. He has taken the seed packets, the ones from the shed, and he has begun a small plot." He said, "A gardener without a garden is a sentence without a verb." Ngozi laughed. She laughed because it was exactly Baba Theo, exactly the shape of him, and because laughing at something that was also tender was the right response to the particular combination of feelings that this story had been producing in her for weeks. She did not know, standing there laughing in the garden with Akosua, that 3 days later Mrs. Amma would call her into the small office off the main corridor and tell her, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they find personally satisfying but professionally are required to present without editorializing, that her wages had been restructured. Restructured was the word Mrs. Amma used. The figure she placed on the paper in front of Ngozi was not the figure Ngozi had twice negotiated upward over 3 years. It was nearly double the second figure. And beneath the wages line, a second item. Samuel's school fees, listed as a compound commitment, fully covered, reviewed annually. Ngozi looked at the paper. She said, "I did not ask for this." Mrs. Amma said, "No, you did not." Ngozi said, "Did he say why?" Mrs. Amma looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been in service in large households long enough to know that the most important things are rarely explained out loud by the people who do them, because explanation draws attention to the gesture and the people who understand giving understand that the gesture is not meant to be attention. She said, "He said you had a brother in school." She paused. "He said everyone deserves someone who notices." Ngozi sat with that for a moment. Everyone deserves someone who notices. She thought about a man reading a letter in a study at 7:47 in the morning. She thought about the specific education of receiving something that dismantles the structure you have built your understanding of the world upon, and then choosing, in the aftermath of that dismantling, to rebuild not the same structure but a different one. A better one. One with more room in it for the people walking through your corridors and your kitchen and your garden every day. She thought about Baba Theo's margin notes. The handwriting in 3 colors across 3 decades. A conversation held with a book across an entire life. She thought about what it meant to keep that kind of record of yourself, to believe that the interior of your experience was worth annotating, was worth returning to and examining and building upon. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who spent their life doing that. She signed the paper. She walked back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and looked out the window at the plumeria trees, which were still at the height of their season, still holding their blossoms in that extravagant, uncomplicated generosity that flowering things practice without thinking. She thought, something was planted here long before any of us arrived, something that had nothing to do with soil, and she thought, it is still growing. On the Tuesday 2 weeks after Akoshua's visit, Baba Theo arrived in the morning as he always did now. He walked the garden. He spoke to the younger gardeners. He sat on the bench near the plumeria with his lunch and his Bible. In the late morning, Adewale came out and sat beside him, as he had been doing, and the two of them talked about the garden and the rains and the particular stubbornness of a section of lawn near the northern wall that had never taken as well as the rest. When Baba Theo stood to leave, he left the Bible on the bench. Ngozi, watching from the kitchen window, thought it was an accident. She went out to call after him, but he was already at the gate, moving with his unhurried pace, and he did not look back. She turned. Adewale had come back to the bench. He was standing over the Bible with his hands in his pockets, looking down at it. She watched him pick it up. She watched him turn it in his hands the way she had turned it on the morning of all of this. She watched him open it. She could not see his face from where she stood, but she saw the moment he found the margin notes because his whole body changed, very slightly, in the particular way of a person encountering something that requires them to be still. He stood at the bench in the garden for a long time. He did not know that Baba Theo had not forgotten his Bible. He had left it on purpose, because a gardener always knows what needs tending next. And the interior of a man Baba Theo had spent 71 years understanding was as much a growing thing as any garden. It required the same patience, the same quality of attention, the same willingness to get down on your knees and put your hands into what was there and work with it, however long it took, until something worth keeping finally broke through the surface. He walked home to his small yard and his new plot and his seed packets arranged on a makeshift shelf, and he was smiling the whole way. The slow sunrise of it, all the way home. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, I think you'll find a home in the other videos on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come join us. There's always a place by the fire at Village Heart. Until next time.